I discovered my daughter-in-law pouring industrial superglue onto the antique chair meant for my wife while my son stood watch, chuckling like it was a harmless joke. I handled it quietly, and hours later when the master of ceremonies asked the bride to stand for a toast, the loud tearing sound of expensive silk left her frozen, exposing her to 200 guests. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Gordon Bennett. I am 70 years old, a retired contractor who spent 4 decades building a quiet, comfortable life with my wife, Martha. We worked hard, lived below our means, and poured everything we had into raising our only son, Justin. We gave him the education we never had and the opportunities we could only dream of. But somewhere along the line, the privileges we provided twisted his perspective. The values of hard work and humility were replaced by a hollow entitlement, especially after he met Monica. Monica was a woman who measured human worth entirely by price tags and zip codes. From the moment Justin brought her into our home, she made it abundantly clear that Martha and I did not meet her standards. She would walk into our modest 3-bedroom house, scanning our worn furniture and family photos with eyes that calculated and dismissed us in a single sweep. The disrespect was never a shouting match. It was a slow, dripping poison. It started with subtle remarks about Martha's clothes. My wife has always been a practical woman, preferring comfortable sweaters and sensible shoes over designer labels. One Sunday afternoon, while Martha was serving coffee, Monica leaned over the table and said, "Martha, you really should let me take you shopping sometime. Those shoes look like they belong in a historical museum. It is important to maintain some level of dignity at your age." Martha simply smiled and patted my hand under the table, silently begging me not to react. I swallowed my anger for her sake. But Justin did not defend his mother. He just laughed and told Monica that his parents were stuck in their ways. The entitlement only grew. Monica started treating our home like her personal storage unit. She and Justin lived in a sleek, expensive downtown apartment that they could barely afford. When she ran out of closet space, she brought 6 massive plastic bins of her seasonal clothes and dumped them in our garage, directly blocking my parking spot. When I asked Justin to move them so I could park my truck inside, Monica rolled her eyes and sighed. "Gordon." "It is just an old pickup truck," Monica said, examining her manicured nails. "It can sit in the driveway. My designer coats are sensitive to temperature changes. You do not really need the garage anyway." I looked at my son, expecting him to correct her, to remind her that this was our home. Instead, Justin put his hands in his pockets and muttered that it was only temporary. I moved the bins myself that evening, feeling the heavy realization that my son saw our home as nothing more than a convenience for his future wife. The real breaking point began when they announced their engagement. They invited us to dinner at an overpriced downtown restaurant to discuss the wedding plans. Justin ordered an expensive bottle of wine, poured himself a glass, and looked at me with a strained, forced smile. "Dad, Mom, we want this wedding to be the event of the year," Justin began. "Monica has always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding at the Pinecrest estate. We have done the math, and the whole thing will cost around $60,000. I set my fork down. "That is a substantial amount of money, Justin. How do you plan to finance this?" Justin avoided my gaze. "Well, we were looking at your retirement accounts, Dad. You and Mom do not spend much. You live a simple life. If you liquidated a portion of your 401k, you could cover the wedding as your gift to us. It is an investment in our future." I stared at my son, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. He was sitting across from me, casually asking me to drain the savings I had broken my back for simply to fund a one-day party. "Absolutely not," I said, my voice low and firm. "My retirement funds are for your mother's security. I will not jeopardize her future for a party." Monica slammed her glass down. "Gordon, that is incredibly selfish. We are your only family. What is the point of hoarding all that money in a bank account when you do not even use it? You drive a rust bucket, and Martha makes her own curtains. You are embarrassing Justin by refusing to help us when you clearly have the means. The audacity of her words hung in the air. I looked at Justin, but he just stared at his plate silently, agreeing with her insult. I took a deep breath, keeping my expression completely neutral. I will not hand you $60,000 in cash, I said. However, I will pay for the venue directly. I will cover the rental of the Pinecrest estate. That is my final offer. Monica scoffed, but Justin quickly accepted, knowing the venue alone was the most expensive part of their budget. What neither of them knew was the reality of my financial situation. I had spent 40 years in construction, buying up distressed properties, rehabilitating them, and turning them into highly profitable real estate. I was not just a retired man living on a pension. Through a private trust, I was the silent majority owner of the Pinecrest estate itself. I agreed to cover the venue because it cost me essentially nothing, but I kept that fact completely to myself. My philosophy had always been that invisible wealth grants you true power. I wanted to see exactly how they would treat me when they thought I was stretching my limited resources for them. The answer came 2 nights before the wedding at the rehearsal dinner. The dinner was held at a prestigious country club surrounded by Monica's affluent friends and family. Martha had spent the previous 3 weeks carefully sewing her own dress for the occasion. It was a beautiful, modest navy blue gown with delicate lace trimming. She was so proud of it, and she looked radiant. When we arrived, we were seated at the far end of the room, away from the main wedding party. We were treated like distant, burdensome relatives. After dinner, I went to the bar to get Martha a glass of water. On my way back, I paused behind a decorative partition near Monica's table. I heard Monica's loud, piercing laugh. One of her friends was asking about Martha. "I cannot believe your mother-in-law wore that," the friend giggled. "It looks like she made it out of old living room drapes." Monica sighed dramatically. "Tell me about it. It is completely humiliating. I told Justin we should have just bought her a dress, but they are so painfully cheap. It is like they enjoy looking like they belong in a soup kitchen. Honestly, it is thrift store trash." I froze. I waited for Justin, who was standing right next to her, to say something. To defend the woman who had sat up nights sewing his Halloween costumes, the woman who had worked double shifts to pay for his college textbooks. Instead, I heard my son's voice dripping with apology. I know, Justin said. "I am sorry, guys. My parents just do not understand how to present themselves in places like this. Just ignore them tonight. They will sit in the back at the wedding anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stepped out from behind the partition and walked back to our table. Martha looked up at me, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. She had gone to the restroom and had walked past the same table, hearing every single word. She was trying so hard to hold her head high, but I could see her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric of her handmade dress. "We are leaving," I told her softly. I drove us home in absolute silence. The boy I had raised, the son I had loved unconditionally, had publicly disowned our dignity to please a woman who despised us. He had reduced his mother's love to thrift store trash. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. I did not yell. I did not call Justin to scream at him. Anger is a loud and useless emotion. True resolution requires cold, calculated silence. The next morning, while Martha slept, I went into my home office and locked the door. I pulled out my private ledger and began making calls. My first call was to my lawyer, Mr. Carlson. I needed to ensure that my legal walls were impenetrable because a few days prior I had caught Justin committing an act that proved his greed knew no bounds. I had come home early from the hardware store and found Justin standing in my office. The drawers of my filing cabinet were pulled open. He was holding a copy of my living will and a blank power of attorney form. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he fumbled with his words, claiming he was just looking for a stapler. "Dad, you know as you get older we need to start thinking about managing your affairs," he had stammered. "Monica says it is better to have these documents signed early just in case your mind starts to go." He was probing for weaknesses, trying to find a way to strip me of my autonomy before I was even in the ground. Mr. Carlson, I said into the phone, I need you to place an immediate lockdown on the family trust. Justin is officially removed as the beneficiary of all estate properties. Liquidate his emergency access funds and prepare a formal eviction notice for his downtown apartment. There was a brief pause on the line. Gordon, you own the building he lives in, Mr. Carlson said. Are you sure you want to proceed with an eviction? I have never been more sure of anything in my life, I replied. I also need you to draft a bill for property damages. I have a feeling the Pinecrest estate is going to suffer some vandalism tomorrow. Have all the documents ready by Sunday morning. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening a storm. My son thought I was a naive old man, completely ignorant of his true nature. He thought he could mock my wife, drain my finances, and quietly take control of my life. He was about to find out that the man who built the very ground he planned to get married on was not someone you ever want to cross. The board was set. The silent adjustment had begun. The morning of the wedding arrived with a heavy gray sky. I drove to the Pinecrest estate 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. As the silent owner of the property, I possessed a master key card and an intimate knowledge of every hallway service corridor and hidden alcove. My official reason for arriving early was simple. I wanted to verify that the modest white roses Martha had lovingly arranged for the guest tables were actually put on display. Monica had threatened to throw them out, and I wanted to protect my wife's small contribution to this lavish affair. I parked my truck near the service entrance and walked through the back corridors. The estate was quiet. The catering staff was busy in the kitchen, their distant clattering echoing down the hall. I made my way toward the main reception room, a grand ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows. I pushed the heavy oak door open just a crack, intending to step inside. A sharp, familiar laugh echoed across the empty ballroom. I froze. It was Monica. I stepped back into the shadow of the doorway, peering through the narrow gap. The room was fully decorated. The tables were set with gleaming silver and tall, ostentatious floral centerpieces that Monica had ordered on credit. At the head of the room, on a slightly elevated platform, sat the main tables, and there, standing next to a row of antique mahogany chairs with plush velvet cushions, were Monica and my son Justin. Monica was wearing a silk bridal robe, her hair and makeup already flawlessly arranged. She held something small and metallic in her hand. Justin stood beside her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, shifting his weight nervously, but smiling. I strained my ears to listen. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried their voices perfectly toward my hidden position. I am telling you, Justin, this is the only way, Monica said, her voice dripping with venom. Your mother is going to ruin every single wedding photograph. Did you see that hideous blue rag she was wearing last night? If she stands next to me in the formal portraits, my entire bridal aesthetic will look like a charity event. My chest tightened. The memory of Martha carefully stitching the hem of that navy blue dress under the dim light of our living room lamp flashed through my mind. She had pricked her fingers countless times, smiling, because she wanted to look beautiful for her son. Justin let out a soft, pathetic chuckle. I know Monica. I told her to buy something from a boutique, but you know how she is. She refuses to spend money. But what exactly are you planning to do? We cannot just ask her to leave. Monica held up the metallic tube. It was industrial superglue, the heavy-duty kind used for construction, capable of bonding fabric to wood and leather with an unbreakable grip. I recognized the brand instantly. It was a tube from my own garage. She had stolen it from my workbench. We are not going to ask her to leave. Monica purred, her eyes gleaming with a malicious excitement. We are going to make her want to leave. She unscrewed the cap of the glue. Justin took a step forward, his eyes widening, but he made absolutely no move to stop her. Watch this, Monica instructed. She walked over to the specific chair designated for Martha. It was an antique seat positioned right near the front, clearly marked with an elegant place card that read, Mother of the Groom. Monica began to squeeze the thick, clear liquid directly onto the dark velvet cushion. She moved her hand in a deliberate zigzag pattern, ensuring maximum coverage across the center of the seat. The sheer decorative fabric provided by the venue was meant to be draped over the chairs for a unified look. Monica carefully pulled the sheer fabric down over the glued cushion, pressing it lightly, so the glue would seep through the thin material without being visibly obvious to anyone looking at it from above. When the master of ceremonies asks the parents to stand for the bridal toast, she will get up, Monica explained, stepping back to admire her trap. The glue cures quickly under body heat and pressure. When she stands, the velvet and the sheer fabric will fuse completely to that cheap homemade skirt of hers. It will rip the back of her dress wide open. She will be so humiliated, so completely mortified, that she will have no choice but to run out of the hall crying. My breathing stopped. The sheer cruelty of the plan was staggering. She was not just trying to exclude Martha. She wanted to publicly degrade a gentle, loving woman in front of 200 people. She wanted to break my wife's spirit just to maintain the visual perfection of her wedding photos. I waited for Justin to intervene. I waited for the boy I had raised to finally wake up, to snatch the glue from her hand, to declare that this was an act of pure evil against his own mother. I waited for him to defend the woman who had given him life. Justin looked at the chair. He looked at Monica. And then my son laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a genuine, entertained chuckle. "Monica, you are insane," Justin said, shaking his head with an amused grin. "She is going to freak out. Are you sure it will dry in time?" "Positive," Monica replied, tossing the empty tube onto a nearby catering tray. "By the time dinner is served, she will be permanently cemented to that chair. And the best part is everyone will just think she bought a cheap, poorly made dress that ripped at the seams. No one will suspect a thing. We will pretend to be so embarrassed for her, and then we will politely suggest she go home to change, which means she misses the formal portraits." Problem solved. I stood in the shadows, perfectly still. My heart did not race with hot, explosive anger. Instead, a profound, absolute coldness settled over me. It was the freezing clarity of a man who suddenly realizes that a disease has become terminal. The son I loved was gone. He had died long ago, replaced by this hollow, greedy shell of a man who found amusement in his mother's impending public humiliation. I did not burst through the doors. I did not shout. Shouting is what weak people do when they lose control. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were completely steady. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the red button. I needed them to speak again. I needed concrete, undeniable proof of their malice. "Are you sure this will not ruin the venue's chair?" Justin asked finally, showing a shred of concern, not for his mother, but for his deposit. "My dad is barely paying for this place as it is. If they charge us for a ruined antique chair, we cannot afford it." Monica scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Who cares about the chair? Your father is a stingy old fool. Let him foot the bill for the damages. He has been hiding his money from us anyway. It is about time he pays for something useful. Just remember, when she runs out crying, you have to act surprised. Do not laugh until we are alone." "I got it," Justin replied. "Operation Ruin the Rag is a go." I hit stop on my phone. The recording was saved. 2 minutes and 14 seconds of pure, unadulterated treachery. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. They turned to leave the ballroom, walking toward the grand staircase that led to the bridal suites. I stepped back into the shadows of the service corridor, pressing myself flat against the cold stone wall as their footsteps echoed past me. They walked right by my hiding spot, completely unaware that the silent, stingy old fool they were mocking had just witnessed the entire conspiracy. I waited until the sound of their voices faded completely into the upper floors. The silence returned to the grand ballroom. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward the head tables. My footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet. I stood in front of the trap Monica had laid. I looked at the delicate place card bearing my wife's name, mother of the groom. I looked at the sheer fabric resting over the velvet cushion. I reached out and hovered my hand just an inch above the seat. I could feel the faint chemical fumes of the industrial glue. It was potent, sticky, and waiting. My wife had done absolutely nothing to deserve this. Martha had spent her entire life giving. She had baked the cakes for Justin's school fundraisers. She had held his hand through his first heartbreak. She had defended him when I was too strict. And this was her reward. A calculated public degradation meant to shatter her dignity. A weak man would have simply removed the chair and warned his wife. A weak man would have taken the place card and thrown the ruined cushion into the dumpster, sparing his family the embarrassment. But I was not a weak man. I was a man who understood that actions must have consequences. I understood that if I simply removed the threat, Monica and Justin would never learn the true cost of their cruelty. They would just find another more insidious way to hurt us. The trap had been set perfectly. The adhesive was strong. The intention was clear. The only thing that was wrong with the scenario was the target. I looked at the chair next to Martha's. The chair positioned exactly in the center of the head table. The chair draped in pristine white sheer fabric marked with an elegant gold embossed card that read "The Beautiful Bride." I did not feel a shred of guilt. I did not feel a moment of hesitation. The decision was logical, precise, and absolute. I reached down and carefully picked up the place card bearing my wife's name. I moved it to a clean, untouched chair further down the table. Then, with steady, deliberate hands, I picked up the chair Monica had glued. It was heavy, made of solid mahogany, but decades of construction work had left me strong. I lifted the ruined chair and carried it directly to the center of the table. I placed it exactly where the bride was supposed to sit. I took the gold-embossed card that read, "The Beautiful Bride," and placed it right in the center of the poisoned cushion. I adjusted the sheer fabric perfectly, ensuring there was absolutely no visual difference. The glue rested silently beneath the thin white veil, waiting for the heat and pressure of a body to activate its permanent bond. I stepped back and surveyed my work. The arrangement looked flawless. The aesthetic was completely undisturbed. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, retreating through the same service corridor I had used to enter. I walked out into the cool morning air, got into my old pickup truck, and drove back home to pick up my wife. I was going to put on my tuxedo. I was going to smile at the guests. I was going to watch my son marry a monster. And then I was going to sit back and watch the universe correct itself. The silent adjustment was no longer just a plan. It was in motion. And the trap they had so carefully laid for a gentle, innocent woman was now waiting patiently for its rightful owner. I remained perfectly still in the shadows of the service corridor long after the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them. The hollow echo of my son laughing with his bride faded down the hallway, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of reality. For a man who had spent his entire life building foundations, the sudden collapse of my own family felt entirely different. It was not a loud crash. It was a silent, terrifying realization that the boy I had raised was entirely gone. I breathed in the cool air of the empty ballroom. A weaker man might have stormed through those doors and demanded an explanation. A foolish man might have yelled and screamed, creating the exact dramatic spectacle Monica thrived on. But anger is a useless tool when you are standing on your own property, holding all the cards. I waited another 5 minutes just to be absolutely certain they had taken the elevator up to the bridal suites. I needed to ensure the catering staff was still occupied in the kitchen and the florists had finished their morning rounds. When the silence in the grand hall was absolute, I stepped out from the shadows. My footsteps made no sound on the thick carpets as I approached the elevated head table. The grand ballroom of the Pinecrest estate was breathtaking, with its cascading crystal chandeliers and towering floral centerpieces. Monica had spared no expense on the aesthetics, utilizing the credit limit she assumed I would eventually pay off. I walked directly to the seat positioned on the far left edge of the family table. There, written in elaborate gold calligraphy, was the place card reading, "Mother of the Groom." I leaned down and inspected the velvet cushion. The chemical stench of the industrial adhesive was sharp and unmistakable. It was a heavy-duty construction-grade superglue designed to bond porous materials instantly upon contact and pressure. I knew this specific brand perfectly because I had bought a case of it for my own workshop just last month. Monica had not just stolen it from my garage. She had researched exactly what would cause the maximum amount of permanent damage to fabric. I hovered my hand an inch above the seat, feeling the slight, radiant heat of the chemical reaction taking place beneath the thin, decorative veil she had draped over it. If Martha sat here, the heat of her body would accelerate the curing process. The delicate navy blue silk she had spent 3 weeks carefully stitching by hand would fuse entirely to the heavy velvet cushion. When the time came for her to stand, the dress would tear violently, leaving my wife exposed and humiliated in front of 200 wealthy strangers. The sheer malice of the trap was breathtaking. I looked at the golden name card again. I could easily take the chair, carry it out the back doors, and toss it into the industrial dumpster. I could replace it with a spare from the storage closet. I could wipe the slate clean and protect my wife from the immediate danger. I could even confront Justin before the ceremony and force him to apologize. But what would that truly accomplish? If I confronted them, Monica would simply play the victim, claiming it was a harmless prank I blew out of proportion. Justin would defend her. They would continue to treat Martha like a burdensome peasant who did not belong in their elevated world. If I removed the consequence, they would never learn the lesson. Throughout my 40 years running a contracting business, I learned that you cannot fix a rotten foundation by painting over the cracks. You have to expose the rot completely before you can build something new. My mind drifted to a memory of Justin when he was 10 years old. He had broken a neighbor window with a baseball and tried to hide the bat in the bushes. I did not yell at him then either. I simply made him walk over to the neighbor, hand them his allowance money, and apologize while looking them directly in the eye. I taught him that every action requires accountability. Somewhere along the way, the extravagant lifestyle he chased had erased that lesson. My son needed to see exactly who he was marrying, and Monica needed to understand the absolute danger of underestimating quiet people. I moved to the center of the head table, where 2 ornate mahogany chairs sat side by side. One was designated for my son. The other bore a large, beautifully embossed card that read, "The Beautiful Bride." The seat cushion was pristine, immaculate, and perfectly safe. I reached out and gently took hold of the bride card. It was attached to the wooden backrest with a small loop of silk ribbon. I untied it with steady fingers, placing it carefully on the table. I walked back over to my wife-designated seat and untied the mother of the groom card. I swapped their positions. I secured Martha's name to the clean, safe chair at the edge of the table. Then I took hold of the heavy mahogany chair Monica had so meticulously sabotaged. I lifted it smoothly, carrying it to the center of the head table. I set it down right where the bride was meant to sit. I took the gold card designated for Monica and tied the silk ribbon firmly around the backrest of the glued chair. The trap was now relocated, but it needed to be visually flawless. Monica was incredibly detail-oriented. If she noticed even a slight wrinkle in the fabric, she would demand the venue staff replace the chair before sitting down. The venue provided sheer white decorative fabrics designed to drape over the seats for a uniform, elegant look. Monica had pulled the fabric down over the glue on Martha's chair to conceal her handiwork. I did the exact same thing for the bridal seat. I pulled the delicate white material taut over the velvet cushion, ensuring it looked perfectly smooth. The adhesive rested invisibly just beneath the surface, waiting for pressure to push the fabric down into its chemical grip. I smoothed out the edges, aligned the chair perfectly with the table, and stepped back to examine my work. There was absolutely no visual difference. The seat looked like a throne fit for a queen. I walked the length of the table one last time, confirming that every detail was exactly as the wedding planner had left it. I checked the placement of the silverware, the alignment of the crystal glasses, and the angle of the floral arrangements. Everything was immaculate. The board was set. The trap was locked. I took my phone out of my pocket and checked the audio file I had recorded earlier. 2 minutes and 14 seconds of crystal clear audio featuring my son and his bride laughing about humiliating my wife. I uploaded the file to my secure cloud storage, ensuring it could never be accidentally deleted or lost. I had the confession. I had the motive. And now the mechanism of their own cruelty was waiting precisely where they least expected it. I left the grand ballroom, closing the heavy oak doors softly behind me. I navigated the service corridors with the familiarity of a man who owned the very walls surrounding him. When I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the gray clouds overhead had finally broken, letting a few rays of sunlight hit the asphalt. I walked to my battered old pickup truck, the same vehicle Monica constantly ridiculed. I slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and listened to the engine roar to life. I drove out of the Pinecrest Estate gates, heading back to my modest 3-bedroom home. I had to put on a tuxedo. I had to stand by my wife and tell her how beautiful she looked in the dress she had made with her own 2 hands. I had to go back to that venue and smile at a room full of people who thought I was nothing more than a poor old man stretching his pennies to give his son a wedding. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a profound sense of peace. The silent adjustment was in place. Monica wanted to create a spectacle that no one would ever forget. I was simply making sure she got exactly what she asked for. I drove back to our small house under a sky that was finally beginning to clear. The morning clouds were breaking apart, allowing sharp rays of sunlight to pierce through the heavy gray atmosphere. I walked through the front door and found Martha standing in front of the hallway mirror. She was smoothing her hands over the navy blue fabric of her dress. The gown was a masterpiece of quiet dignity. She had spent every evening for the last 3 weeks meticulously cutting and pinning the silk, ensuring every seam was perfectly straight. Her fingers were calloused from decades of scrubbing floors and cooking meals for our son, but they moved over the delicate lace with profound grace. She turned to me as I entered the hallway. Her eyes carried a fragile, nervous hope. She asked me if the dress looked too simple for such an extravagant venue. She worried that she might embarrass Justin in front of his new, wealthy family. I walked across the worn carpet and took her hands in mine. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that she was the most beautiful woman I had ever known. I told her that any room she entered was immediately graced by her presence. I meant every single word with the entirety of my soul. I left her to finish her makeup and went into the bedroom to put on my rented tuxedo. As I buttoned my crisp white shirt and adjusted my black bow tie, I realized that my anger had completely evaporated. The hot, burning rage that had consumed me in the ballroom had cooled into a solid block of ice. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of his son's morality. I was an architect stepping onto a job site ready to execute a precise structural demolition. We drove to the Pinecrest Estate in my battered pickup truck. The engine rumbled loudly as we passed through the towering wrought iron gates of the venue. The property was transformed into a sickening display of excess. Valets in spotless white uniforms rushed forward to open the doors of imported luxury cars. Women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits drifted across the manicured lawns, sipping champagne from crystal flutes. It was a world constructed entirely on credit and arrogance. I handed the keys to a valet who looked at my truck with a poorly disguised sneer. I simply offered him a polite nod and offered Martha my arm. We walked toward the botanical gardens, where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. The path was lined with hundreds of white roses imported halfway across the world just to satisfy Monica and her endless demands. When we reached the seating area, an usher directed us to the front row. Justin was already standing at the altar waiting for his bride. He was wearing a custom black suit that cost more than my first vehicle. When he saw us approaching, he immediately broke away from his groomsmen and walked toward us. He projected the image of a perfect, grateful son. He wrapped his arms around his mother, hugging her tightly and kissing her on the cheek. He thanked her for all her help and told her how wonderful she looked. It was a terrifying performance. Just hours ago, I had stood in the shadows and listened to him laugh at a plot designed to humiliate this very woman. I watched him lie to her face without a single hesitation or stutter. He turned to me and extended his hand. I took it firmly. His palm was damp with sweat. He looked into my eyes, trying to project confidence, but he could not hold my gaze. He quickly looked away and returned to his position at the altar. A string quartet began to play a slow, classical melody, signaling the start of the procession. The guests rose to their feet. I stood beside Martha, keeping my posture rigid and my expression entirely neutral. Monica appeared at the end of the long garden aisle. She was escorted by her father, a man who had spent the entire rehearsal dinner bragging about his golf handicap. Monica looked like a porcelain doll. Her custom gown trailed 10 feet behind her, shimmering under the afternoon sun. She walked with her head held high, offering shy, sweet smiles to the guests as she passed their rows. When she reached the front, she paused directly in front of Martha and me. She looked at my wife, and her lips curved into a bright, radiant smile. It was a look of absolute triumph. She believed she was looking at a woman who was just hours away from becoming a laughingstock. She thought she held all the power in the world. I returned her smile with a slow, polite nod of my own. She turned toward Justin and took his hands. The officiant began to speak. He delivered a long, winding speech about the purity of love, the importance of trust, and the unbreakable foundation of family. Every single word rang hollow in my ears. I listened to Monica recite her vows. She spoke with a trembling, emotional voice, wiping away a perfectly timed tear. She promised to cherish Justin, to honor his family, and to build a life rooted in honesty and compassion. The guests in the rows behind us sighed in collective adoration. Several women sniffled and dabbed their eyes with silk handkerchiefs. The hypocrisy was so thick, it was almost suffocating. I looked down at Martha. She was watching the ceremony, with her hands clasped together, completely captivated by the illusion. I reached over and gently took her hand, holding it tightly in mine. I grounded myself in the reality of her warmth. I knew that the vows being spoken were nothing but cheap theater, but the justice waiting in the reception hall was entirely real. The ceremony concluded with a roaring applause from the crowd. Justin and Monica shared a passionate kiss, posing perfectly for the photographers swarming around the altar. The string quartet shifted into a lively, upbeat tempo. The newly married couple marched back down the aisle, showered with white rose petals thrown by cheering guests. They disappeared into the main estate building, retreating to a private bridal suite to celebrate their flawless performance. The wedding planner. A frantic woman holding a silver clipboard began directing the 200 guests toward the grand ballroom for the formal reception. Martha and I walked with the slow-moving crowd, leaving the bright sunshine of the gardens for the cool, dimly lit corridors of the estate interior. Martha leaned against my shoulder, whispering that she had never experienced anything so grand in her entire life. She pointed out the towering ice sculptures and the silver trays of appetizers floating past us, carried by waiters in white gloves. I simply nodded, keeping my focus entirely on the heavy oak doors of the ballroom ahead. As we crossed the threshold, the volume in the room swelled. Guests were rushing to find their tables, marveling at the sheer extravagance of the decor. I ignored the chaos and led Martha directly toward the elevated platform at the head of the room. We walked up the short steps to the main family table. I guided her to the chair at the far left edge. I looked down at the velvet cushion, ensuring the gold place card reading "Mother of the Groom" was resting safely on the untouched fabric. I pulled the chair out for my wife. She smiled and sat down carefully, smoothing the skirt of her navy blue dress over her lap. She was completely safe. I took my designated seat right beside her. I looked down the length of the long table. Directly in the center sat the 2 ornate mahogany chairs meant for the bride and groom. The chair on the right was draped in pristine white sheer fabric marked with the card reading "The Beautiful Bride." To anyone else in the room, it looked like a throne waiting for royalty. But I knew exactly what lay beneath that delicate white veil. The industrial adhesive was resting silently in the velvet fibers, waiting for the heat and pressure of a human body to activate its permanent chemical bond. Waiters began pouring champagne into crystal flutes at every table. The clinking of glasses and the loud, joyful chatter of the guests filled the massive hall. The atmosphere was charged with celebration and excitement, but the only thing I felt was the steady rhythmic ticking of a clock counting down to 0. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone positioned near the dance floor. He tapped the metal grill lightly, sending a sharp, echoing thud through the speakers. He asked the guests to please take their seats and direct their attention to the grand staircase. The bridal party was about to make their entrance. I sat back in my chair, taking a slow, deep sip of my water. I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over my entire body. I looked at Martha, who was clapping her hands in eager anticipation. I had secured my perimeter. I had protected my family. The trap they had so maliciously engineered was primed and ready. The waiting game was finally over. The doors at the top of the staircase swung open, and the crowd erupted into a deafening roar. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, pushed by the white-gloved venue staff. A wave of classical music mixed with the low hum of affluent chatter spilled out into the foyer. The master of ceremonies, a man with a booming theatrical voice, tapped his microphone. He asked the 200 guests to rise to their feet and welcome the new couple. The applause was immediate and deafening. I stood beside Martha, keeping my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I watched as Justin and Monica made their grand entrance. Monica walked into the room as if she had just conquered a small nation. She held her head high, her posture stiff with self-importance. She waved to the crowd, soaking in the admiration. Her custom $12,000 gown flowed around her, a massive cascade of imported silk and delicate French lace. Justin walked beside her, projecting the image of a wealthy, successful groom. He smiled and waved, completely oblivious to the reality that the very floor he walked on was owned by the father he had so casually discarded. They made their way through the sea of cheering guests, heading directly for the elevated platform at the front of the room. The head table sat draped in pristine white linen, decorated with towering crystal vases and imported white roses. I watched Monica approach the center of the table. She paused for a moment, letting the photographer capture her standing before her designated throne. She looked down at the chair I had prepared for her. The sheer white fabric rested flawlessly over the velvet cushion, hiding the thick zigzag pattern of industrial adhesive beneath. She did not suspect a single thing. Why would she? In her mind, the world was a perfectly ordered place designed exclusively to cater to her desires. She reached back, gathering the heavy layers of her silk skirt, and lowered herself into the chair. I let out a slow, controlled breath as her weight settled onto the cushion. The trap was sprung. Industrial superglue is a fascinating chemical compound. I spent 40 years on construction sites working with every type of adhesive and sealant known to man. I knew the specific properties of the brand I had used. It was not designed for quick, superficial fixes. It was engineered to bond porous materials permanently. It requires 2 elements to reach its maximum curing strength. It needs steady applied pressure, and it needs a consistent source of heat. Monica was currently providing both. As she shifted in her seat, making herself comfortable, she pressed the delicate silk of her dress firmly through the sheer venue fabric and directly into the thick layer of glue. The heat radiating from her body would accelerate the chemical reaction. The adhesive was already seeping into the microscopic fibers of her $12,000 gown, wrapping around the silk threads and hardening into an unbreakable matrix. Every minute she sat there drinking champagne and laughing at the toasts, the bond grew stronger. Within 20 minutes, the fabric of her dress would be completely fused to the solid mahogany chair. Martha and I were seated at a smaller table positioned near the edge of the elevated platform. It was a slight intentional physical demotion from the main bridal party, a final petty insult Monica had arranged. Martha did not seem to notice or care. She sat beside me, smoothing the skirt of her handmade navy blue dress. She looked around the magnificent ballroom, her eyes wide with genuine awe. "Gordon, this place is truly magical," Martha whispered, leaning closer to me. "I know it cost a fortune, but looking at Justin smiling up there, it almost feels worth it. He looks so handsome." I looked at my wife. Her heart was so pure, so entirely devoid of the malice that infected the two people sitting at the center table. She had spent the entire morning worrying that her simple dress would embarrass her son. She had no idea that she was the only person in this room who possessed any real dignity. I reached under the table and covered her calloused hand with mine. "You look more beautiful than anyone in this room, Martha," I told her softly, "and you have nothing to be ashamed of. We belong here exactly as much as anyone else." She smiled, a small, relieved expression crossing her face. I turned my attention back to the room, projecting an aura of total, absolute calm. I was no longer the humiliated father from the rehearsal dinner. I was the silent orchestrator of the evening. The first course was served. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved seamlessly between the tables, placing plates of seared scallops and artisan salads in front of the guests. The volume of conversation rose as the wine began to flow freely. I ate my meal with steady, measured bites. I watched Monica across the room. She was holding court, leaning back against the heavily glued cushion, throwing her head back in loud laughter. With every movement, she ground the expensive lace of her gown deeper into the hardening trap. The tension inside me was not born of anxiety. It was the cold, thrilling anticipation of an inevitable mathematical equation. The longer she sat, the worse it would be. A man approached our table carrying a crystal glass of whiskey. It was Richard, Monica's father. He was a wealthy investment banker who had spent the entire weekend making thinly veiled remarks about my career as a simple contractor. He pulled up an empty chair and sat down next to me, smelling of expensive cologne and arrogance. "Gordon," he said, flashing a bright, predatory smile. "Quite the spread tonight, is it not? I have to admit I was a little worried when Monica told me you were handling the venue logistics. You never know how these things turn out when people try to cut corners. But it looks like you managed to pull together some pennies for the kids." I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and turned to face him. I kept my expression completely blank. I did not bristle at the insult. I simply observed him the way one observes a loud insect. "I believe in ensuring that people get exactly what they deserve, Richard." I replied, my voice low and even. "Justin and Monica have worked very hard to create this specific aesthetic. I merely provided the foundation for their choices." Richard chuckled, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Well, they certainly have expensive taste. Monica has always demanded the best. She gets that from me. We do not settle for second rate in our family. I imagine it is a bit of a culture shock for you two being surrounded by all this high-end luxury." He gestured vaguely toward Martha's handmade dress with his glass. "Just try to enjoy the free meal, Gordon." Martha stiffened beside me, her cheeks flushing a deep red. She looked down at her plate, her joy instantly evaporating. Richard had executed the insult perfectly, using the guise of polite conversation to remind us of our supposed inferiority. A day ago, I would have gritted my teeth and stared at the floor. Today, I looked Richard directly in the eye. My gaze was so flat, so completely devoid of intimidation, that his arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "We are enjoying it immensely, Richard," I said. "In fact, I anticipate this evening will be one of the most memorable events in Pinecrest Estate history. I have a feeling your daughter is going to make an impression that no one here will ever forget." Richard looked at me, slightly confused by the total lack of subservience in my tone. He opened his mouth to deliver another barb, but the master of ceremonies suddenly spoke over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen," the booming voice announced, cutting through the chatter of the room, "we hope you are enjoying this magnificent dinner. As we prepare for the main course, it is tradition to pause and honor the two people who have brought us all together tonight." Richard tapped the table and stood up. "That is my cue," he said, straightening his tie. "Try not to spill anything on the tablecloth, Gordon." He walked away, heading toward the front to prepare for the toasts. I turned my attention back to the head table. Justin was grinning proudly, holding a glass of champagne. Monica was adjusting her hair, preparing to be the center of the universe. She shifted her weight again, sliding her hips slightly forward. The glue had been curing for nearly 45 minutes now. I knew the chemical reality. The bond was complete. The heavy mahogany chair, the venue's sheer white fabric, and her $12,000 custom silk gown were now a single fused entity. The master of ceremonies continued his speech, waxing poetic about the joining of two incredible families. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the table. The anticipation was a heavy physical weight in the air. The trap had been laid with absolute precision. The arrogance of my son and his bride had led them exactly to this point. I looked at Monica's radiant, gloating face. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully humiliated my wife and secured her perfect, flawless aesthetic. She had absolutely no idea that she was permanently chained to her own cruelty. I took a slow sip of ice water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I did not blink. I waited for the inevitable command. I waited for the moment the universe would finally rip the mask off her perfect life. Gordon walked into the empty reception hall, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. It was hours before the wedding guests were scheduled to arrive, and the vast room felt eerily hollow. He was there to inspect the floral arrangements, a small detail he wanted to verify for Martha. Instead, he found Monica and Justin standing near the head table. Monica was already in her silk rehearsal dress, her hair pinned up perfectly. She held a small metallic tube. Gordon recognized it immediately. It was industrial superglue from his own garage workbench. He stopped pressing himself into the shadows of a large decorative pillar. "I am telling you, Justin, this is the only way," Monica said, her voice sharp and calculating. "Your mother is going to ruin every single wedding photograph. If she stands next to me in those formal portraits, my entire bridal aesthetic will look like a charity event." Justin let out a soft chuckle, shifting his weight nervously. "I know Monica. I told her to buy something from a boutique, but she refuses to spend money. But what exactly are you planning to do?" "We are going to make her want to leave," Monica replied, her eyes gleaming. She walked over to a specific chair at the head table. Gordon saw the elegant place card resting on the velvet cushion. It read, "Mother of the Groom." Monica unscrewed the cap and began squeezing the thick, clear liquid directly onto the dark velvet. She moved her hand in a deliberate zigzag pattern, ensuring maximum coverage across the center of the seat. "When the master of ceremonies asks the parents to stand for the bridal toast, she will get up," Monica explained, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "The glue cures quickly under body heat. When she stands, the velvet and the sheer fabric will fuse completely to that cheap homemade skirt of hers. It will rip the back of her dress wide open. She will be so humiliated that she will have no choice but to run out crying." Gordon waited for his son to intervene, to snatch the glue away, to defend the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. Instead, Justin looked at the chair, looked at his bride, and laughed. "Monica, you are insane," Justin said, shaking his head with an amused grin. "She is going to freak out. Are you sure it will dry in time?" "Positive," Monica replied, pulling the venue's sheer decorative fabric down over the glued cushion to conceal her trap. "No one will suspect a thing. We will pretend to be embarrassed for her, and then we will politely suggest she go home to change. Problem solved." Gordon did not react with explosive anger. A cold, absolute clarity washed over him. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the voice recording app. He pressed record, capturing the final seconds of their plotting. "Are you sure this will not ruin the venue's chair?" Justin asked. "My dad is barely paying for this place as it is. We cannot afford the damages." "Who cares about the chair?" Monica scoffed. "Your father is a stingy old fool. Let him foot the bill. Just remember, when she runs out crying, you have to act surprised. Do not laugh until we are alone." "I got it," Justin replied. "Operation Ruin the Rag is a go." Gordon hit stop on his phone and saved the file. He waited in the shadows as Monica and Justin turned and walked out of the ballroom, their laughter fading down the corridor. When the room was entirely silent, Gordon stepped out and approached the head table. He looked at the poisoned cushion meant for his wife. He did not feel anger. He felt the precise, calculating logic of a man about to correct a structural flaw. He looked down the table to the ornate mahogany chair positioned dead center. It was draped in pristine white fabric marked with a gold-embossed card that read, "The Beautiful Bride." Gordon reached out and untied the silk ribbon holding Monica's card. He set it carefully on the table. He walked over to Martha's designated chair, untied her card, and moved it to a safe, clean seat further down the table. With steady, deliberate movements, Gordon lifted the heavy mahogany chair Monica had sabotaged. He carried it to the center of the head table and placed it exactly where the bride was supposed to sit. He took the gold card that read, "The Beautiful Bride," and tied it firmly around the backrest of the glued chair. He adjusted the sheer white fabric, pulling it taut over the velvet cushion. The industrial adhesive rested invisibly beneath the thin veil, waiting for the heat and pressure of a body to activate its permanent bond. Gordon stepped back, surveying his work. The arrangement was flawless. The aesthetic was completely undisturbed. He turned around and walked out of the ballroom, retreating through the same silent corridor. He walked out into the cool morning air, got into his old pickup truck, and drove home to pick up his wife. He was going to put on his tuxedo smile at the guests and watch the universe correct itself. The echo of the ripping silk hung in the grand ballroom for a fraction of a second before the true nightmare began. Monica dropped heavily back onto the cushion, her face completely draining of color. Her hands flew down to her sides, grabbing frantically at the torn edges of her $12,000 custom gown. Her manicured fingers brushed against the thick, tacky residue of the industrial adhesive that had soaked completely through the venue's sheer white fabric and bonded with the heavy velvet cushion. The reality of her situation registered in her wide, panicked eyes. She tried to shift her weight, to slide her hips forward, but the bond was absolute. She was permanently fused to the solid mahogany chair. A low murmur began to ripple through the sea of 200 guests. It started as a confused whisper and quickly swelled into a loud, buzzing wave of shock. People were stretching their necks, craning over the elaborate floral centerpieces, trying to get a better look at the bride who had just exposed her undergarments to the entire room. Then the screaming started. Monica let out a sound that did not belong at a wedding reception. It was a visceral, ear-piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hands against the head table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes and knocking over a towering arrangement of imported white roses. The vase shattered across the polished wood, sending water and glass sliding toward the edge of the platform. "Do not just stand there," she screamed, her voice cracking as she glared at Justin. "Do something! I am stuck. Pull me up." Justin stood frozen beside her, his mouth opening and closing completely devoid of any useful instinct. He reached out, grabbing her forearms, and tried to yank her upward. Monica shrieked again as the remaining intact fabric of her dress strained against the glue, pulling painfully tight across her waist. "Stop pulling, you idiot," she spat, smacking his hands away. "You are tearing it worse." I sat perfectly still at my table, directly in the line of sight of the chaos. I picked up my glass of ice water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was cold and refreshing. I watched my son run his hands through his styled hair, his face flushed bright red with a mixture of profound embarrassment and utter panic. He looked entirely pathetic. He looked like a man who had traded his backbone for a superficial life he could not even control. Martha sat beside me, her hand covering her mouth in shock. She leaned toward me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Gordon, what is happening?" she whispered. "What is wrong with her dress?" I kept my voice low and soothing. "It looks like an unfortunate accident, Martha. Just stay seated. Let them handle it." I did not offer to help. I did not stand up. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their own malice unfold exactly as they had planned it for my wife. Monica's panic rapidly metastasized into a violent hysteria. She needed a target, and she found one in the venue staff. She pointed a shaking finger at a young waiter who had rushed forward with a linen napkin. "Who did this?" Monica shrieked, her face contorted with fury. "Which one of you incompetent fools put glue on my chair? You ruined my dress. You ruined my wedding. I am going to sue this entire estate into bankruptcy." The young waiter backed away, terrified, holding his hands up in defense. More staff members hurried into the ballroom, drawn by the screaming. The guests were now openly staring, some covering their mouths in horror, while others discreetly pulled out their phones to capture the unprecedented meltdown. The wedding planner, a woman who had been running around all morning with a silver clipboard, pushed her way through the crowd of stunned waiters. She climbed the steps to the elevated platform, her eyes scanning the torn silk and the white fabric fused to the velvet cushion. She leaned in close, inspecting the sticky residue. "Oh my goodness," the planner whispered, her professional composure cracking. "This is construction adhesive. This is not from our staff. I do not care where it came from." Monica sobbed violently, hitting the table again. "Get me out of this chair right now. Get me a solvent. Get me some water. Get me something to dissolve it." The planner shook her head, her face pale. "Water will not dissolve industrial glue, Mom. If we try to use harsh chemical solvents, it will burn right through the remaining silk, and it could cause severe chemical burns to your skin. The adhesive has completely bonded the lace to the wood and the cushion." Justin leaned over the table, his voice pitching up an octave. "What are you saying? Are you saying she cannot get up? She has to dance. We have a routine planned. She has to cut the cake. She cannot stand up, sir," the planner said, her voice tight with stress. "The bond is too strong. If we try to forcibly pull her off the chair, we will rip the entire back half of her dress completely off. The gown is already severely compromised." Monica heard the words and let out a guttural sob, burying her face in her hands. Her perfect, immaculate aesthetic was dead. The fairy tale she had demanded, the illusion of superiority she had built to make others feel small, had evaporated. She was sitting in a ruined dress glued to a piece of furniture, crying hysterically in front of the wealthy friends she had tried so hard to impress. "You have to cut it," the planner finally said, looking directly at Justin. "We have to cut the dress away from the chair. It is the only way to free her without causing injury." "Cut my custom gown!" Monica screamed, whipping her head up. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. "Are you out of your mind? This dress cost $12,000. You are not taking scissors to my dress." Justin looked around the room, seeing the 200 pairs of eyes fixed entirely on them. The whispering had grown louder. The embarrassment was suffocating him. He grabbed Monica by the shoulders, his voice dropping into an angry, desperate whisper. "Monica." "We do not have a choice," Justin hissed. "You cannot just sit here for the rest of the night. Everyone is staring at you. You are making a scene. Let her cut the dress. We will figure it out later." Monica looked at Justin, her eyes filled with a venomous betrayal. She realized he cared more about stopping the public spectacle than he cared about her precious gown. She collapsed back against the wooden frame of the chair, sobbing uncontrollably, entirely defeated by the trap she had set with her own hands. "Do it!" Monica cried, her voice muffled by her hands. "Just get me out of here." The wedding planner signaled to one of the catering staff, who ran quickly toward the kitchen. The room remained in a state of suspended animation. No one spoke loudly. No music played. The string quartet had completely stopped, their instruments resting silently in their hands. The only sound in the massive, elegant ballroom was the loud, ugly sobbing of a bride whose arrogance had literally glued her to her own downfall. The staff member returned moments later, carrying a pair of heavy silver kitchen shears. The wedding planner took them, stepping behind Monica's chair. She crouched down, gripping the thick layers of silk and imported lace. "I am so sorry," the planner whispered. The sound of the heavy shears cutting through the expensive fabric echoed across the silent room. It was a thick, relentless, crunching noise. Every snip was a death blow to Monica's vanity. The planner had to cut a massive rectangular chunk out of the lower back and skirt of the gown, separating the free fabric from the portion that was permanently cemented to the velvet cushion. It took nearly 5 agonizing minutes. 5 minutes of Monica crying, while Justin paced back and forth, completely helpless. I sat quietly at my table, watching the precise execution of consequences. I looked at Martha, who was holding my arm, her face pale with shock. She had no idea that the sharp crunch of those scissors was the sound of her own salvation. If I had not moved that place card, she would be the one crying in the center of the room. She would be the one having her dignity shredded by strangers. Finally, the planner stepped back, lowering the scissors. "You are free," she said softly. Monica pushed herself up from the chair. The front of the dress remained intact, but the entire back section was gone. Her undergarments and bare skin were completely exposed to the crowded ballroom. She let out a sharp gasp, crossing her arms over her chest, trying uselessly to cover herself. She looked around the room at the sea of wide, staring eyes. She saw the pity. She saw the shock. She saw the absolute ruin of her perfect day. "We need something to cover her," Justin snapped, yelling at the waiters. "Bring a jacket. Bring anything." A quick-thinking busboy grabbed a stack of clean white catering tablecloths from a nearby service cart. He handed one to Justin, who quickly unfolded the heavy square of cotton and wrapped it awkwardly around Monica's waist, tying it in a bulky knot at her hip. The elegant $12,000 bridal silhouette was replaced by the humiliating drape of a cheap banquet cloth. Monica did not look at anyone. She kept her head down, her face hidden by her falling hair. She grabbed the edges of the tablecloth, pulling it tight against her legs, and practically ran down the steps of the elevated platform. She pushed past the waiters, sprinting blindly toward the exit doors. Justin stood at the head table looking out at the 200 guests. He opened his mouth as if to make an announcement to salvage the situation, but no words came out. He looked at the ruined mahogany chair with a massive chunk of silk and lace permanently glued to its center. He dropped his gaze to the floor, turning and jogging after his bride, leaving his own reception entirely abandoned. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them. The ballroom remained perfectly quiet for a long, terrible moment. Then a low hum of conversation erupted across the tables. The shock broke out, giving way to intense animated gossip. I slowly set my glass of water down on the linen tablecloth. The performance was over. The poison had been drawn out and neutralized. Martha turned to me, her eyes filled with a deep, sympathetic sadness. "Gordon, that was awful," she whispered. "That poor girl. Her special day is completely ruined." I looked at my wife, admiring the boundless, endless depth of her compassion. Even after everything Monica had said to her, Martha still felt sympathy for the girl's pain. It was exactly why I had to protect her. "It is a tragedy, Martha," I said, my voice completely steady. "But sometimes people build their own traps. Come on, let us go home. The party is over." The morning after the wedding, the house was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of black coffee while the early sunlight crept through the blinds. Martha was standing by the sink, washing the few dishes we had used for breakfast. She moved slowly, her shoulders slumped, still visibly shaken by the chaotic end to the previous night. She had no idea that I had moved the place cards. She genuinely believed that a bizarre, terrifying accident had humiliated her new daughter-in-law. I watched my wife and felt a profound sense of peace, knowing she had been spared from Monica and her malicious trap. The quiet morning shattered with the sound of tires screeching violently into our driveway. A car door slammed with enough force to rattle the front windows. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded up the concrete walkway. Before Martha could even reach for a drying towel, the front door flew open, crashing against the wall. Justin stormed into the hallway and marched directly into the kitchen. He looked entirely deranged. He was still wearing the black dress trousers from his tuxedo, wrinkled and stained near the cuffs. His white undershirt was untucked and completely unbuttoned at the collar. His hair stood up in wild angles and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic. He did not look like a groom the morning after his wedding. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night pacing the floor of a hotel room, trapped in a cage with a hysterical woman. He stopped in the center of the kitchen, breathing heavily, and glared at me. He did not say good morning. He did not ask how his mother was doing. He simply pointed a trembling finger at my chest and demanded that I get my lawyer on the phone immediately. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter liquid warm my throat. I placed the mug gently on the wooden table and asked my son why I would possibly need to call my lawyer on a Sunday morning. Justin slammed his hands down on the kitchen counter, causing Martha to flinch. "Because you signed the contract for the Pinecrest estate," he shouted, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "You are the client on record. You are the one who paid for the venue, which means you are the only one who can initiate the lawsuit. They ruined my wedding. They humiliated Monica in front of 200 of the most important people in our social circle. We are going to sue that venue into the ground, and you are going to be the one to do it." Martha took a hesitant step forward, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Justin, please lower your voice," she pleaded softly. "What happened to Monica was terrible, but it was just an accident. Why would we sue anybody?" Justin whipped his head toward his mother, his eyes filled with a toxic, furious contempt. "It was not an accident," he snarled. "Someone put industrial construction glue on the bride chair. Someone deliberately targeted Monica to destroy her perfect day. The venue staff must have done it out of spite because Monica demanded perfection. They are incompetent, spiteful criminals. Monica has been locked in the bathroom of our apartment all night, sobbing until she threw up. She is entirely traumatized. Her $12,000 custom silk gown was ripped to shreds. I watched the veins bulge in my son's neck as he screamed his fabricated narrative. He was standing in my kitchen, demanding that I launch a massive legal battle against my own estate to penalize innocent staff members for a crime his own wife had committed. The sheer audacity of his performance was almost hypnotic. He was lying straight to our faces, projecting total righteous indignation. I thought about the audio recording sitting safely on my phone where he laughed at the idea of his own mother being glued to a chair. I looked at him calmly and stated that I would not be calling any lawyers. I told him that I refused to drag a respected venue into a frivolous lawsuit over a ruined dress. Justin's face turned a deep, mottled red. He began pacing the length of the kitchen, running his hands frantically through his hair. He muttered under his breath, cursing my stubbornness before stopping and planting his feet firmly in front of the table. "Fine," he spat. "If you are too much of a coward to hold the venue accountable, then you are going to fix this yourself. Lawsuits take months anyway, and Monica needs to be made whole right now. You are going to write me a check today. $15,000 cash." Martha let out a small gasp, pressing her hand over her heart. $15,000, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Justin, we do not have that kind of money just lying around to give away." Justin ignored her completely, keeping his furious gaze locked entirely on me. $12,000 to replace the exact cost of the destroyed custom gown, he dictated aggressively, and $3,000 to compensate Monica for the severe emotional distress she suffered. "We need to book a luxury getaway right now to salvage our honeymoon and make her forget this absolute disaster. You paid for the venue, so you are responsible for what happened inside it. Write the check." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He was attempting to extort $15,000 from his parents to fund a luxury vacation as an apology for his wife falling into her own trap. He viewed my finances as an open vault waiting to be raided to soothe Monica and her bruised ego. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and delivered my answer with a flat, absolute finality. I told him no. I told him he would not get $15,000. I told him he would not get 15 cents. I advised him to go home, comfort his wife, and learn how to move on from an unfortunate embarrassment. Justin's eyes widened in genuine shock. He had spent his entire life pushing boundaries, throwing tantrums, and watching his mother step in to smooth things over. He fully expected me to cave under the pressure of his demands just to restore the peace. When he realized my refusal was absolute, his shock twisted into something incredibly ugly. He resorted to the ultimate weapon of the entitled and manipulative child. He resorted to emotional blackmail. "You are really going to do this?" he hissed, stepping so close to the table I could smell the stale alcohol radiating from his pores. You are going to choose your pathetic little bank account over your only son. Let me make this completely clear to you right now. If you do not write that check, you are dead to me." Martha let out a broken sob, reaching her hand out toward him. "Justin, please do not say things like that," she wept. "We are your parents. We love you." Justin did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on mine, his voice dropping into a cold, vicious register. "I mean it," he promised. "If you refuse to help us after we have been so publicly humiliated, we are done. We will block your phone numbers. We will never step foot in this cheap house again. When Monica and I have children, you will never meet them. You will never see your grandchildren. You will spend the rest of your lives sitting in this depressing kitchen, and you will die completely alone. Is a $15,000 check really worth losing your entire family?" He delivered the ultimatum, expecting to see me crumble. He expected me to look at Martha crying quietly by the sink and feel a crushing wave of guilt. He weaponized the concept of unborn grandchildren, knowing it was the one thing Martha wanted more than anything else in the world. He was using her pain to try and pry open my wallet. I looked at the stranger wearing my sun face. Any lingering trace of paternal affection I held for him evaporated into the cold morning air. I realized with absolute clarity that keeping Justin in our lives was not a blessing. It was a terminal disease. He would drain us financially, emotionally, and spiritually until there was nothing left but dust. Cutting him out of our lives was not a punishment to us. It was a liberation. I stood up from the table. The wooden legs of my chair scraped loudly against the floor, breaking the tension in the room. I stood at my full height, squaring my shoulders. I pointed my finger toward the front door. "Get out of my house," I commanded, my voice echoing with a low, dangerous authority. Justin blinked, his confident sneer slipping for a fraction of a second. "Dad." "I am warning you," he tried to say, stepping backward instinctively. "I said get out," I repeated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You will not come into my home, disrespect your mother, and demand money to fix a mess your own wife created. You made your choice. Now walk out that door and do not ever come back." Justin stared at me, his chest heaving. He realized I was not bluffing. The extortion had failed. The emotional blackmail had completely backfired. He had played his final card, and I had ripped it in half. A primal, childish rage consumed him. He let out a furious scream and swept his arm across the kitchen counter. He knocked Martha's favorite ceramic coffee mug onto the floor. It shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, sending cold coffee splashing across the tiles. "You are going to regret this," Justin screamed, spitting the words at me as he backed away toward the hallway. "You are going to die alone, and nobody is going to care. You are going to pay for ruining my life." He spun around and stormed out of the house. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, shaking the picture frames hanging on the hallway walls. Moments later, the screech of his tires echoed down the quiet suburban street as he sped away. The house fell back into a deep, profound silence. The only sound was the gentle humming of the refrigerator. Martha stood by the sink, covering her face with her hands, weeping softly into her palms. Her heart was broken, grieving the loss of a son who had just declared war on his own family. I did not feel broken. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming sense of purpose. I walked over to the kitchen counter and retrieved the broom and dustpan from the corner. I knelt down on the floor and began sweeping up the shattered pieces of the ceramic mug. I was cleaning up the physical mess my son had left behind, just as I was preparing to clean up the financial and legal mess he had invited into his life. Justin wanted a war. He wanted to blame me for his humiliation. He wanted to threaten me and tear down my peace. He had absolutely no idea that his demands and his tantrums were completely useless against a man who already controlled the entire battlefield. I swept the broken ceramic into the dustpan and poured it into the trash, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a man who was ready to deliver absolute justice. The evening sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floors of my study. Martha had gone to bed early, exhausted by the emotional toll of our son and his violent departure. I sat at my oak desk reviewing the blueprints for a new commercial contract. I preferred the quiet precision of architectural lines to the messy unpredictability of human greed. The silence was broken by the sharp buzzing of my cell phone. The caller ID displayed the name Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was the owner of the Pinecrest estate and a friend I had known for nearly 3 decades. We had worked together closely. I had personally overseen the structural restoration of the estate and its grand ballroom 5 years ago. Arthur did not offer his usual warm greeting. His voice was breathless, tight, with a panic I had never heard from him before. He asked me if I had looked at the internet today. He told me his business phones were ringing off the hook, and his email inbox was flooding with cancellation threats from panicked brides. He sounded like a man watching his life work burn to the ground. I opened my laptop and asked him to send me the link. A moment later, an alert popped up on my screen. I clicked the web address, and a video began to play. It was uploaded to a major social media platform, and it had already amassed over 400,000 views. The title of the broadcast was written in bold, sensational letters, claiming a nightmare wedding and malicious sabotage. Monica filled the center of the screen. She had orchestrated the lighting and her wardrobe with the same manipulative precision she used to choose her wedding flowers. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment, wrapped in a heavy, oversized gray sweater that made her look fragile and small. Her makeup was deliberately smudged, giving the illusion that she had been weeping for hours. She looked directly into the camera, projecting a masterclass in manufactured vulnerability. She took a shuddering breath, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. She began her story by describing the magic of her wedding morning. She spoke about the love she felt for Justin and the dreams she had for their perfect reception. Then her voice cracked. She described the horrific moment she tried to stand up for the bridal toast, only to realize she was bound to her chair. She held up the ruined remnants of her $12,000 custom silk gown. She displayed the jagged, torn edges of the lace to the camera, weeping loudly about how the venue staff had maliciously covered her seat in industrial adhesive. She claimed it was a coordinated attack by spiteful, underpaid workers who were jealous of her beautiful event. I watched the screen, my expression entirely neutral. Her ability to lie without a single flicker of remorse was almost pathological. But she did not stop at blaming the catering staff. She took a deep, shaky breath and shifted her narrative directly toward me. She looked down at her hands, playing the role of a concerned, reluctant victim. She whispered that she felt terrible even mentioning it, but she had to be honest about the contractor who managed the venue logistics. She identified me as her father-in-law. She told her hundreds of thousands of viewers that I was an old, stubborn man who had been acting increasingly erratic and confused over the past few months. She painted a picture of a senile, bitter blue-collar worker who resented her refined tastes. She hypothesized with fake, tragic sympathy that I must have suffered a mental break. She suggested that my jealousy and dementia drove me to tamper with the decorations, to ruin a day I could never afford to give my own wife. It was a brilliantly wicked execution of character assassination. By framing my supposed sabotage as an act of senile dementia, she insulated herself from looking vindictive. She looked like a sweet, forgiving girl dealing with a crazy, dangerous old man. The comment section beneath the video was a raging waterfall of public outrage. Thousands of strangers were demanding justice for the beautiful bride. They were calling for the immediate boycott of the Pinecrest estate. They were tagging local news stations, demanding that the senile contractor be investigated and arrested for property damage and emotional abuse. Arthur was still on the line, breathing heavily into the receiver. He told me that his venue rating had plummeted in a matter of hours. Angry mobs were flooding his business pages with fake one-star reviews. Couples who had booked the estate for the upcoming summer season were pulling their deposits, citing fears of malicious staff and unsafe conditions. Arthur had poured his entire life savings into keeping that historic estate running through economic downturns. Now, a spoiled bride with a smartphone was dismantling his legacy with a single fabricated sob story. I assured Arthur that he would not lose his business. I told him to lock his administrative accounts and issue a standard brief statement asking the public for patience while a formal investigation took place. I promised him that the fire would be extinguished very soon. He thanked me, his voice still shaking, and ended the call. I turned my attention back to the video. Monica was reaching the grand finale of her performance. Having established herself as the victim of both corporate malice and senile abuse, she pivoted seamlessly to the grift. She wiped her eyes and explained that she and Justin were completely devastated financially. She claimed they had poured their life savings into the venue and the dress, and now they were left with nothing but trauma and debt. A link appeared at the bottom of the screen. It was a digital fundraising campaign. She begged her viewers to donate whatever they could spare to help them recover the cost of the destroyed gown and perhaps afford a small honeymoon to heal their broken hearts. I watched the donation counter tick upward in real time. $10 here, $50 there. People from across the country were throwing their hard-earned money at a woman who lived in a luxury apartment and treated service workers like dirt. Within hours, the campaign had already raised over $8,000. It was no longer just a petty family dispute. It was no longer just a bride throwing a tantrum over a ruined dress. By creating a fraudulent public campaign based on deliberate lies to solicit money, Monica had crossed a very distinct legal boundary. She had committed wire fraud. She had committed public defamation against a commercial entity. She had committed slander against my name. She thought she was untouchable because she controlled the narrative on her social media page. She believed that whoever cried the loudest and looked the prettiest would automatically win the sympathy of the world. She failed to realize that the internet is a permanent record. Every lie she spoke to the camera, every dollar she accepted under false pretenses was another nail in her own coffin. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small black external hard drive. I connected it to my laptop and began meticulously downloading every piece of evidence. I saved a high-definition copy of her tearful broadcast. I took screenshots of the donation page capturing the exact monetary figures and the fraudulent claims written in the campaign description. I documented the hundreds of defamatory comments directed at Arthur and his estate and my own construction firm. Then I opened the audio file I had recorded in the empty ballroom the morning of the wedding. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The sharp, calculating voice of Monica filled my ears. I listened to her explicitly detail her plan to glue Martha to the chair. I listened to Justin laugh and agree to the sabotage. I listened to Monica clearly state her intention to use the venue furniture as a weapon to humiliate my wife. The contrast between the vicious, arrogant woman on the audio recording and the weeping, fragile victim in the video was absolute perfection. It was the kind of irrefutable, concrete evidence that defense attorneys had nightmares about. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the digital numbers on her fraudulent campaign continue to rise. Justin had stood in my kitchen just 12 hours ago, screaming that I was going to die alone and pay for ruining his life. He demanded $15,000. Now his wife was illegally extorting that money from sympathetic strangers while simultaneously attempting to destroy the livelihood of my oldest friend. They had weaponized public opinion. They had weaponized my age. They had weaponized their own deceit. But a weapon is only effective if your target does not see it coming. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Marcus Vance. Marcus was not a family law attorney. He was a senior partner at a firm that specialized in corporate litigation and severe defamation. He was a man who moved with the silent, crushing efficiency of a glacier. I checked the time. It was late, but Marcus was a man who lived for his work. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow for the son I had lost. I felt only the deep, quiet satisfaction of a builder who had just found the critical load-bearing pillar of his enemy and their fortress. I was going to let Monica collect her fraudulent donations. I was going to let her bask in the glow of the sympathy of the world. I was going to let her climb to the very top of her pedestal, and then I was going to bring the entire structure crashing down around her. The The morning sun barely cut through the heavy gray clouds gathering over the neighborhood. I sat in my study watching the digital numbers on the fraudulent campaign Monica had created climb higher and higher. The entire internet was convinced I was a malicious, senile old man who had ruined a beautiful wedding out of pure spite. I closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen. Martha was standing by the stove stirring a pot of oatmeal. Her eyes were red and swollen. She had seen the video. She had heard the vicious things our son and his wife were saying about us to the entire world. She could not understand how the boy she raised could participate in such a cruel public execution. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood beside her. I told her that a storm was coming, but that she was completely safe. I told her to trust me. The doorbell rang with a sharp, aggressive buzz. It did not sound like a friendly visitor. It sounded like an invasion. I walked down the hallway and opened the heavy wooden door. Justin stood on the porch. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place for a Tuesday morning. Standing next to him was a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore a cheap gray suit that fit poorly around the shoulders. His shoes were scuffed, and his tie was carelessly knotted. He did not look like a man who protected wealth. He looked like a bottom feeder who helped impatient children steal from their vulnerable parents. He carried a thick leather briefcase and wore a smile that looked like a thin layer of oil over a puddle of mud. Justin did not wait for an invitation. He pushed past me into the foyer, gesturing for the stranger to follow. He walked directly into the living room and dropped himself onto the center of the sofa. He looked at the antique clock on the mantel and the original paintings on the walls. He was no longer looking at his childhood home. He was looking at an inventory of assets he was about to liquidate. I closed the front door and followed them into the living room. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Dad, sit down," Justin said, his voice dripping with a fake syrupy concern. "We need to have a very serious conversation about your future." I remained standing. I asked him who the man in the cheap suit was. Justin sighed, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "This is Mr. Davis," he explained, gesturing to the stranger. "He is a legal consultant. He works with families who are dealing with difficult transitions. I brought him here today because I love you, and I want to protect you from the mess you have created." Mr. Davis opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He placed them carefully on the glass coffee table. He looked at me with a practiced expression of deep sympathy. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Your son has explained the situation to me. I understand that the past few days have been incredibly confusing for you. I know you have been experiencing some severe memory lapses and some uncharacteristic outbursts of anger. We are here to make sure you are protected." I looked at the stack of papers. I felt a cold, absolute calm settle over my entire body. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were laying the groundwork for a mental incompetence claim. They were using the false narrative Monica had established on the internet to build a legal cage around me. I asked Mr. Davis what exactly I needed protection from. Justin leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You need protection from the Pinecrest estate, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a serious whisper. "The venue is preparing a massive counter-lawsuit. The video Monica posted went completely viral. People are canceling their weddings. The estate is losing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they are coming after you. You signed the contract. You are legally responsible for everything that happened in that building. They are going to sue you for defamation and loss of revenue. They are going to take this house. They are going to empty your retirement accounts. You and Mom are going to be left with absolutely nothing." I looked at Justin, admiring the sheer brazenness of his lie. I had spoken to Arthur, the owner of the estate, the night before. I knew for a fact there was no counter-lawsuit being filed against me. Arthur was busy managing the public relations disaster Monica had caused. Justin had fabricated a massive legal threat to terrify me into submission. He was using fear to bypass my logic. Martha gasped, stepping into the living room. "Justin, Is that true? She asked, her voice trembling with genuine terror. Are we going to lose our home? Justin looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a predatory warmth. I will not let that happen, Mom, he promised. That is why I brought Mr. Davis. We have a plan to protect your assets before the venue lawyers can freeze your accounts. But we have to act right now. Mr. Davis pushed the stack of papers across the glass table toward me. He handed me a heavy silver pen. These are asset protection documents, Mr. Caldwell, the consultant explained smoothly. They include a property deed transfer and a durable power of attorney. By signing these, you are temporarily transferring the ownership of this house and the control of your finances to your son. The venue cannot seize assets that you do not legally own. Justin will hold everything in a secure trust until the lawsuit blows over. It is a standard procedure for families facing aggressive litigation. It was a brilliantly evil trap. If I signed those papers, I would instantly become a guest in my own home. Justin would have total, unrestricted access to my bank accounts. He could drain my life savings to pay off the ruined dress and fund an extravagant lifestyle. He could evict Martha and me from the house we had lived in for 30 years. He would own my entire existence. I asked Justin what would happen if I chose not to sign the documents. I asked him what would happen if I decided to face the venue lawyers on my own. The face of my son hardened. The fake concern evaporated, leaving behind a cold, vicious calculation. He stood up from the sofa and walked toward me. He stopped just inches away from my face, looking down at me with absolute contempt. You do not have a choice, Dad, he whispered menacingly. You are not thinking clearly. You have been acting completely insane. You sabotaged my wedding. You refused to help us when we were humiliated. Monica has documented everything. We have witnesses who saw you acting erratically at the reception. If you refuse to sign these papers to protect your own wife, I will be forced to take this to a judge. I will testify that you are suffering from severe dementia. I will have you declared legally incompetent. The state will strip you of your rights and appoint me as your guardian anyway. You can do this the easy way and sign the papers now, or you can do it the hard way and let me humiliate you in a courtroom. I felt the intense, heavy gravity of his threat pressing down on the room. He was holding a gun to my dignity. He was threatening to strip away my autonomy and lock me in a legal prison if I did not hand over my wallet. It was the ultimate betrayal. He had ceased to be my son entirely. He was simply a criminal demanding a ransom. I looked at Martha. She was standing frozen in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of her own child. I knew that I could throw them out right then. I knew I could scream and threaten to call the police. But throwing them out would mean losing the physical evidence sitting on my coffee table. I needed those fraudulent documents. I needed the forged power of attorney to complete the steel trap I was building for my son. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly. I looked down at the floor, projecting the image of a broken, terrified old man. I took a shaky breath and looked up at Mr. Davis. I do not understand all this legal jargon, I said, my voice cracking perfectly. I am so tired. My head hurts from all this stress. I do not want to lose my house. I do not want to go to court. Justin smiled, a sickening expression of victory spreading across his face. He reached out and patted my shoulder, patronizingly. It is okay, Dad, he said softly. I know it is confusing. Just sign the papers and I will take care of everything. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again. I reached out and touched the thick stack of documents. I hesitated, letting my hand hover over the signature line. I looked at Justin with wide, frightened eyes. I cannot just sign away my house without reading it, Justin, I pleaded, letting my voice sound desperate and small. Please just let me read them tonight. Let me sit in my chair and read the words slowly. My eyes are not as good as they used to be. I promise I will sign them first thing in the morning. Just give me one night to understand what I am doing. Justin frowned, his jaw clenching with impatience. He wanted the ink on the paper right now. He wanted absolute control before he walked out the door. He opened his mouth to argue, but Mr. Davis placed a restraining hand on his arm. The shady consultant looked at Justin and offered a barely perceptible nod. "That is completely understandable, Mr. Caldwell," the consultant said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "It is a big decision. We want you to feel comfortable. We will leave the documents here with you tonight. Take your time and read through them. Justin will come by tomorrow morning to collect the signed paperwork. We are only trying to help you." Justin looked at the papers and then looked at me. He was reluctant to leave the trap unsprung, but his arrogant belief in my supposed weakness convinced him he had already won. He believed I was a senile, terrified old man who had no other options. "Fine," Justin snapped. "I will be here at 8 tomorrow morning. Have them signed. Do not make me do this the hard way, Dad. For your own sake and for Mom." He turned around and marched out of the living room, followed closely by the greasy consultant. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the heavy front door open and close. I listened to the sound of his car engine starting and fading down the street. The moment the house was silent, the trembling in my hands stopped completely. The slump in my shoulders vanished. The frightened old man evaporated, leaving behind the cold, calculating architect. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the thick stack of fraudulent documents. They were beautiful. They were the final pieces of concrete evidence I needed to permanently destroy the people who had tried to bury me. Martha walked over to me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Gordon, what are we going to do?" She wept, gripping my arm. "He is going to take our house. He is going to declare you insane. We have to sign the papers. We cannot fight him in court." I looked at my wife, my heart aching for the terror she had been forced to endure. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. I kissed the top of her head and stroked her back until her sobbing began to subside. "We are not signing anything, Martha," I promised her, my voice solid and unwavering. "Justin thinks he is playing a game of checkers. He has no idea that I have already flipped the board. He handed me the exact weapon I need to stop him forever." I released her and walked directly to my study. I spread the papers out across the polished wood of my desk. I read through the dense legal paragraphs. The power of attorney was incredibly broad. It gave Justin the authority to empty my bank accounts, to sell my vehicles, to take out loans against my property, and to make all of my medical decisions. It was a license to erase my entire existence. They had typed up a death warrant for my independence and expected me to gladly sign it. I opened my laptop and retrieved my phone. I needed a specific kind of specialist to handle an aggressive, coordinated attack on my estate and my freedom. I needed someone who dealt with elder exploitation and severe financial crimes. I scrolled through my contact list until I found the name Mr. Carlson. Mr. Carlson was a former federal prosecutor who now ran an elite private law firm. He was a man who did not send polite warning letters. He sent absolute ruin. So I pressed the call button and listened to the steady ringing of the line. The trap was fully constructed. The bait had been taken. It was time to drop the steel cage. I picked up the phone on Tuesday morning and dialed my son. When Justin answered, his voice was thick with hostility and suspicion. I knew exactly how to play him. I had spent my entire life watching him manipulate his mother by exploiting her desire for peace. I simply mirrored that exact vulnerability. I kept my tone soft and defeated, playing the role of a terrified old man who had finally realized the error of his ways. I told Justin that I had spent the last 2 days reflecting on his words and the viral video Monica had posted. I lied with absolute conviction. I said the public backlash had terrified me and that I could not bear the thought of losing my relationship with my only son. I told him I had spoken privately with Arthur Pendleton, the owner of the Pinecrest estate. I explained that Arthur was bleeding money from the canceled bookings and was desperate to stop the social media bleeding. I promised Justin that I had convinced the owner to sit down for a private settlement meeting. I assured him that Arthur was ready to write a substantial check to make the public relations disaster go away quietly. Justin swallowed the bait without a single moment of hesitation. The hostility in his voice instantly morphed into a smug, triumphant gloat. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not care about the stress I was supposedly under. He simply asked if Arthur was bringing a certified cashier check. I told him yes. He laughed a sharp, victorious sound and told me to meet them at the estate gates at exactly 2 o'clock. I arrived at the Pinecrest estate 30 minutes early. The sweeping manicured lawns and towering stone architecture looked entirely peaceful under the bright afternoon sun. I stood by the grand iron entrance gates, waiting for the architects of my supposed downfall. Right on time, a sleek silver rental car pulled up the winding gravel driveway. Justin and Monica stepped out, and their posture told me everything I needed to know about their state of mind. They were practically vibrating with greed. Monica wore a designer beige trench coat and oversized dark sunglasses, projecting the image of a wealthy celebrity hiding from the paparazzi. She clutched a leather handbag that likely cost more than a down payment on a modest home. Justin walked beside her with his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He truly believed he had broken me. He believed his childish temper tantrum and Monica fraudulent internet campaign had brought a wealthy business owner and his own father to their knees. Justin did not offer a hug or a handshake. He stopped in front of me and immediately demanded to know if Arthur was ready to pay. I kept my expression entirely blank. I gave a slow, hesitant nod and told them to follow me inside. We walked through the grand foyer. Monica clicked her heels loudly against the marble floor, letting out a theatrical sigh. She complained that just being back in this building was triggering her trauma. She loudly announced to no one in particular that $15,000 was a very conservative estimate for the emotional damage she had endured. She hinted to Justin that she might demand $20,000 once she got the owner in the room. I let her talk. I let the poison spill from her lips without offering a single word of resistance. I guided them down the long vaulted corridor, away from the main reception halls and toward the executive wing of the estate. The walls here were lined with dark oak paneling and vintage oil portraits, projecting an atmosphere of old money and serious business. Justin looked around, whistling softly. He patted me hard on the shoulder, telling me that I had finally done something right. He praised me for manipulating Arthur into a settlement, calling it a smart, strategic move. We reached the end of the corridor. A pair of heavy frosted glass doors marked the entrance to the main executive boardroom. I pushed the brass handles and the doors swung open silently. I stepped aside, keeping my head slightly bowed, allowing Justin and Monica to enter the room first. The boardroom was massive and intimidating. It featured a long, polished mahogany table surrounded by 12 plush leather executive chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the botanical gardens below, but the heavy velvet curtains were drawn halfway, casting the room in cool, intimidating shadows. The air conditioning hummed quietly. Arthur Pendleton was nowhere to be seen. Sitting exactly halfway down the long table was a man who looked like he had been carved directly from granite. Mr. Carlson wore an immaculate charcoal suit that spoke of exorbitant hourly rates. His silver hair was perfectly combed back, and his sharp, pale eyes tracked Justin and Monica with the detached precision of a predator observing a very ignorant meal. He did not smile. He did not stand up to greet them. He simply rested his large hands on a thick stack of manila folders and waited in absolute silence. Justin stopped dead in his tracks, his arrogant smirk faltering. He looked around the empty corners of the vast room before looking back at the stranger. He turned to me, his voice laced with sudden confusion. He asked me where Arthur was and who the man in the suit was supposed to be. Monica crossed her arms tightly over her chest, scoffing loudly. She demanded to know if Arthur had sent a junior lawyer to handle his dirty work. She announced with a shrill sense of entitlement that she would not speak to a subordinate. She demanded that the owner present himself immediately with her compensation check, or she would walk out and double her online fundraising goal. I did not answer her. I stopped playing the part of the defeated old man. I straightened my posture, feeling the familiar solid strength return to my spine. I walked past my son and his bride, my footsteps echoing steadily against the hardwood floor. I did not take a seat at the side of the table like a guest or a quiet mediator. I walked directly to the massive, high-backed leather chair positioned at the very head of the boardroom table. It was the seat of absolute authority. I pulled it back and sat down, resting my forearms heavily on the polished wood. I looked down the length of the table at Justin and Monica. They were standing awkwardly near the doorway, their confidence slowly evaporating into a dense, nervous tension. They suddenly looked incredibly small. I gestured toward the two empty chairs positioned directly across from Mr. Carlson. I told them to take a seat. I told them we had a great deal of serious business to discuss and that Arthur Pendleton would not be joining us today or any other day. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. Justin swallowed hard, his eyes darting between my calm expression and the icy stare of the lawyer sitting nearby. He finally realized that the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. The hunt was over, and the trap had officially snapped shut. Justin broke the silence first. He placed his hands on the leather back of an empty chair and leaned forward. He asked me again where Arthur was and why I was sitting in the executive seat. He demanded that we stop playing games and produce the settlement check. He reiterated that Monica had been through enough trauma and that they were ready to collect their compensation and leave. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table. I looked at the young man I had raised. I told him that Arthur Pendleton was not coming because Arthur Pendleton did not make the financial decisions for this property. I explained that Arthur was merely the operational manager. I let the words hang in the cool air of the boardroom. I watched Justin blink, trying to process the information. I told him that I had purchased the Pinecrest estate outright 5 years ago during its structural restoration. I stated clearly and calmly that I was the majority owner of the venue and the surrounding grounds. Monica let out a sharp laugh. It was a brittle, nervous sound. She looked at Justin and told him I was losing my mind. She insisted I was a delusionary old man trying to impress a real lawyer. She demanded that Mr. Carlson remove me from the room and fetch the real owner. Mr. Carlson did not move. He kept his pale eyes fixed entirely on her. He stated that I was telling the absolute truth. He confirmed that Gordon Caldwell was the sole proprietor of Pinecrest Estate and its commercial properties. He added that I was also his wealthiest client. The color drained out of the face of my son. He stared at me as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath him. The reality of his colossal miscalculation was beginning to dawn on him. He had spent his entire life treating me like a disposable wallet, unaware that he was insulting the man who owned the ground he walked on. He stammered, asking how it was possible that we lived in a small suburban house if I owned multi-million-dollar estates. I told him that his mother and I preferred a quiet life. I explained that wealth was a tool to build security, not a loud, obnoxious costume to wear for strangers. I told him I kept it hidden to ensure he learned the value of hard work. I noted dryly that my experiment had clearly been a massive failure. Monica recovered her voice. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany table. She screamed that she did not care who owned the building. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest and declared that my ownership made me directly responsible for her ruined wedding. She stated that my staff had maliciously glued her to a chair and destroyed her custom gown. She demanded her $15,000 immediately, threatening to take the story to the national news if I refused to pay. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I placed it gently on the table. I told Monica that I agreed someone should be held accountable for the ruined dress and the public humiliation. I tapped the screen and opened the audio file I had recorded the morning of the wedding. I turned the volume all the way up. The pristine acoustics of the executive boardroom amplified the sound perfectly. Monica and her crisp, arrogant voice echoed off the oak-paneled walls. The recording played her exact words, detailing how she was going to make Martha want to leave. The recording played Justin laughing nervously, asking what she was planning to do. Then came the chilling explanation. Monica detailed how she was going to use industrial construction glue on the velvet cushion. She explicitly stated her intention to humiliate Martha so severely that my wife would be forced to run out crying. She bragged about the venue fabric fusing to the homemade dress. I stopped the recording. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the expensive watch on the wrist of Mr. Carlson. Monica took a stumbling step backward. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The arrogant, wealthy victim facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Justin looked at his wife and then looked at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He realized I had known their plan before the wedding even started. He realized I had watched him lie in my kitchen demanding money for a crime he helped orchestrate. Justin tried to speak. He stammered that it was a joke. He claimed they were just blowing off steam and talking nonsense. He desperately tried to argue that talking about a prank was not the same as actually doing it. He insisted the staff must have heard them joking and decided to execute the sabotage to frame them. It was a pathetic, desperate lie. I did not argue with him. I simply reached over and turned my laptop around, so the screen faced them directly. I pressed a button on the keyboard. The high-definition security footage from the grand ballroom began to play. The camera angle was positioned perfectly above the head table. It showed the empty room in stark clarity. It showed Monica in her rehearsal dress walking up to the elevated platform. It showed her unscrewing the cap of the adhesive tube. The footage clearly displayed her pouring the thick industrial glue in a zigzag pattern across the velvet cushion of the chair meant for the mother of the groom. It showed her pulling the white sheer fabric down to hide the trap. It captured her smiling as she walked away. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. I looked at Monica. I told her that she was not a victim. I told her she was a malicious, cruel woman who had blindly stumbled into her own trap because I had simply rearranged the seating cards. The legs of my son seemed to give out. He slumped into one of the heavy leather chairs, burying his face in his hands. He muttered over and over that his life was over. Monica stood frozen, staring at the blank laptop screen as if it were a ghost. The reality of her situation crushed the air out of her lungs. She had no defense. She had no lies left to spin. She was completely trapped in a cage of her own making. I leaned back in my chair and turned to Mr. Carlson. I told him that I believed we were finished with the evidentiary portion of the meeting. I asked him to proceed with the legal consequences. Mr. Carlson nodded slowly. He picked up the first manila folder from his stack and slid it across the long, polished table. It stopped precisely in front of Monica. He spoke in a voice that was devoid of any emotion or sympathy. He informed her that the document was a formal invoice for property damage. He explained that the mahogany chair she had permanently ruined with construction adhesive was an authentic 18th century antique imported from a French estate. He stated that the cost to replace the destroyed historic piece was exactly $14,200. He told her that payment was due within 30 days or a lien would be placed against her luxury apartment and vehicles. Monica let out a small, suffocated gasp. She looked at the invoice, her hands trembling violently. She could not comprehend the reversal of fortune. She had walked into the room expecting a massive payout and was instead handed a crippling bill. Mr. Carlson did not give her time to recover. He slid a second, thicker document across the table. He announced that this was a formal cease and desist order. He detailed her fraudulent social media campaign. He explicitly laid out how soliciting financial donations under false pretenses across state lines constituted federal wire fraud. He informed her that my legal team had already archived every deceptive video, every false claim, and every dollar she had collected. He leaned forward, resting his large hands on the table. He told Monica that she had exactly 2 hours to delete the videos permanently. He ordered her to immediately refund every single donation she had received. He warned her that if she kept a single penny of that money or uttered another defamatory word against the Pinecrest estate or the Caldwell family, he would personally ensure she faced federal prosecution. He promised her a very long prison sentence. Justin looked up, his face a mask of absolute terror. He looked at me begging for mercy. He called me Dad and pleaded with me to stop the lawyers. He promised they would pay for the chair and delete the videos. He begged me not to send his wife to prison. I looked at the boy I had raised. I felt nothing but the cold, clean satisfaction of a completed demolition. I told him he had made his choices. I told him he had chosen greed and cruelty over his own mother. I told him that I was no longer his father and he was no longer my son. I instructed them to take their paperwork and leave my property immediately. I promised them that if they ever contacted Martha or me again, Mr. Carlson would bring the full weight of the law down upon their heads. They did not say another word. They gathered the documents with shaking hands and practically ran out of the boardroom. The heavy frosted glass doors closed behind them, sealing their fate. I sat in the quiet room listening to the silence return. The structure had been cleared. The foundation was secure. I finally allowed myself to smile. The heavy frosted glass doors had barely settled into their frames before I turned my attention back to Mr. Carlson. I told him we were not finished. I instructed him to bring out the final 2 documents. Justin and Monica had stopped in the hallway outside the boardroom. They were frozen in shock, unable to walk away from the wreckage of their loss. They slowly turned around and stepped back into the doorway. Their faces were pale and completely drained of their former arrogance. Justin looked at the new folders on the table and asked me what else I could possibly take from him. I looked at my son and told him I was taking back exactly what belonged to me. I explained that for the past 7 years, he had been receiving a massive monthly deposit from a corporate family trust fund. He had used that money to finance his expensive dinners and his tailored suits and his lavish lifestyle. He had always assumed it was a standard dividend from a distant wealthy relative. I told him that I was the sole funder and administrator of that trust. I told him that as of 9:00 this morning, the trust had been permanently dissolved. I stated that the bank accounts he relied on to survive were currently empty and would remain empty forever. Monica let out a sharp gasp, gripping the doorframe to keep her balance. She turned to Justin, demanding to know how they were supposed to pay their massive credit card bills. She asked him how they were going to afford the rent on their luxury downtown condominium without his trust fund. Justin looked at her with hollow, terrified eyes. He stammered that they would figure it out, and that they would just have to rely on their savings until he found a much higher-paying job. He tried to project a shred of fake confidence, telling his wife that at least they still had their beautiful home to return to. I rested my hands flat against the polished mahogany table. I told Monica that she would not have to worry about paying the rent on the condominium. I explained that she would not have to pay the rent because the condominium was no longer available for them to live in. Justin stepped forward, shaking his head in frantic, rapid denial. He insisted that the apartment was strictly in his name and that I had absolutely no legal right to touch his home. He claimed I was making empty threats to scare them. Mr. Carlson cleared his throat, sliding the final thick document across the table. He informed Justin that the condominium was actually registered to a commercial holding company called Caldwell Enterprises. He stated clearly that I was the sole owner and chief executive of that holding company. He explained that I had secretly purchased the unit years ago and had been heavily subsidizing their rent every single month to ensure my son had a safe place to live. He delivered the final crushing blow, telling them that Caldwell Enterprises had officially listed the property for sale that very afternoon. He stated that they had exactly 30 days to pack their belongings and vacate the premises entirely. The absolute reality of the situation crashed down upon them like a collapsing concrete building. They had walked into the Pinecrest estate demanding $15,000 and the total destruction of my reputation. They were walking out with a massive damage debt, 0 monthly income, and a formal eviction notice. They were entirely ruined. Monica stared at Justin with pure, unadulterated disgust. She realized she had married a broke, arrogant boy who had just lost the only financial lifeline keeping them afloat. She turned away from him and walked out of the building without saying another word. Justin collapsed to his knees right there on the expensive boardroom floor. The arrogant, entitled boy vanished completely. He was replaced by a desperate, weeping child. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out toward my chair. He begged me to stop the legal proceedings and reverse the paperwork. He cried that he was my only son and that I could not leave him homeless and destitute in the streets. He pleaded with me to remember all the good times we had shared when he was young. He swore that Monica had manipulated his mind and that he never truly wanted to hurt his mother. He begged me to call Martha and let him apologize to her directly over the phone. He promised he would do absolutely anything to make it right. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the weeping man on the floor. I felt no pity in my heart. I felt no parental urge to reach down and comfort him in his misery. The boy I had loved died the moment he laughed at the idea of permanently humiliating my wife. He had eagerly traded his own family for the shallow approval of a cruel, vindictive woman. I told Justin that he had made his choices with absolute clarity and malicious intent. I told him that he had viewed my kindness as a weakness and my quiet life as a target for brutal exploitation. I stated that Martha had spent her entire life pouring unconditional love into his hollow, ungrateful heart. I told him that I would protect her peace and her happiness with every single resource and legal avenue I possessed. I informed him that my protection meant completely removing the toxic infection he had brought into our lives. I stood up from the executive chair and walked around the long, polished table. I looked down at Justin and delivered my final, absolute words. I told him to go out into the real world and learn how to be a responsible man. I told him to earn his own money and pay his own debts with his own sweat. I told him that he was no longer welcome in my life or my home. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving my former son crying on the floor, next to the shattered remnants of his own greed. The drive home was quiet and deeply peaceful. The heavy gray clouds that had covered the city all morning finally began to break apart, allowing the late afternoon sun to shine through the windshield. I drove through the familiar suburban streets, feeling the immense pressure of the past week completely lift from my shoulders. I pulled into my driveway and parked the car. I walked up the concrete path and opened the front door. Martha was sitting in the living room, knitting a small, soft blanket. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching my face for any sign of bad news or lingering conflict. I took off my coat and walked directly over to her. I sat down beside her on the sofa and took her warm, gentle hands in mine. I smiled at her, feeling a profound, deep sense of relief wash over my chest. I told her that the storm was finally over. I told her that the venue was safe and the vicious lies had been permanently silenced by the truth. I told her that we were finally completely free. We spent the rest of the evening sitting together on the back porch. We drank warm, sweet tea and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of bright orange and deep purple. We did not talk about Justin. We did not talk about the ruined wedding or the cruel woman who had tried to destroy us. We talked about the garden and the upcoming spring planting season. We talked about the quiet, simple, beautiful life we had built together over 40 long years. The evening air was cool and clean. The house felt lighter, as if a tremendous dark weight had been lifted directly from the foundation. We were alone, but we were safe. We had protected our peace, and we were ready to enjoy the rest of our lives in beautiful, unbroken silence. The greatest lesson we can learn from this story is that true wealth is not measured by the size of a bank account or the luxury of a lifestyle. True wealth is found in integrity, respect, and the quiet peace of a loving home. When we allow greed and entitlement to replace gratitude, we destroy the very foundation of family. Protecting your peace often requires making incredibly painful decisions, including walking away from those who only view your love as a resource to be exploited. Boundaries are necessary for survival, and respect must always be earned. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and let me know how you would handle such a difficult family betrayal.